So this next section will talk about the differences between ischemic strokes and hemorrhagic strokes. These are very different presentations in regards to the blockage of blood supply or the actual proliferation of blood supply in terms of leakage in the brain tissue in a hemorrhagic stroke. So I like to use the analogy, it's like having a hose that has a kink in it. That would be a way to describe a hemorrhagic, or excuse me, ischemic stroke. So there's a blockage, and in this case, the water supply is not able to reach the sprinkler, right? And or is a partial blockage, so the hose is partially kinked. That's a way of visualizing a blockage in one of the main blood supplies to the brain, right? To parts of the brain. Or conversely, a hemorrhagic stroke, there is a major leak in that hose, and the water supply is going all over the place, okay? So you have a newly set lawn, and there's this leak, and it's a kind of a big leak, and everything that you've planted is now being flooded and damaged. Well, similarly with a hemorrhagic stroke, other parts of the brain or brain tissue is being damaged by this onslaught of blood going where it's not supposed to go. And the pressure of this can cause significant damage to parts of the brain and brain tissue. So let's look at the differences in terms of these two types of stroke. So ischemic are most common. I mentioned can be caused by a plaque or arterial narrowing. So there are conditions such as vascular dementia that we'll talk about more next year, where the vessels that supply blood to our various arteries become more narrow, and as a result there can be little mini strokes that can occur because of that narrowing. So that is one example. And as a result of damage to certain main arteries and vessels, as we discussed earlier when we discussed the circle of Willis and the basilar artery, the middle cerebral artery, and the anterior cerebral artery, there's predictable results when blood supply does not reach those important areas of executive function, for example, and those important areas of the brain that control hearing, for example, or parts of the brain that are fundamental to vision. And when there's some blockage, the symptoms of stroke develop and worsen over time. Okay, so think about vascular dementia, and that over time this is getting worse and worse and worse, right? Because these little mini strokes are happening. Or in case of a major stroke that's untreated, the symptoms are going to get worse in terms of balance, when we refer to the cerebellum, or some of the executive function when we refer to the frontal lobe. So the warning symptoms can vary depending upon a part of the brain that is damaged over time, specifically. And as I mentioned, the impairments are somewhat predictable. The hemorrhagic is less common. So this is where that pressure, so you think about, let's say there's a closed space. So let's take away the, um, uh, let's just look at the hose, right? And put some pressure around that hose. Let's say there's a balloon or something around that leak. And so there's a limitation of space. Okay, there's a seal around this hose. And over time, that seal or that balloon expands, and it can only expand so much. So think about the brain having a limited amount of space and having more and more of that blood leakage occupying that space. So as a result, there's going to be swelling and significant damage if that bleed continues. And damage meaning to those important areas of our brain that are part of speech, important part of the brain that are part of hearing, vision, balance. And these symptoms are often very sudden, just like the worst possible headache that you can imagine is occurring. And the impairment certainly will vary dependent upon the amount of blood that's leaking or the extent of the arterial damage, or a smaller leak versus a larger leak.